Hello everyone, today is Monday the 4th of September 2017. It is block height 483,533. And I'd like to say that every single person that's here right now watching this video is exactly who needs to be here. And I've got a lot of comments, a lot of people sort of asking me, you know, why we're not doing this on another certain channel or whatever, or like how many views we're getting is not very high. And I just want to make it clear that like I never did this for the fame. When I came onto YouTube, I started talking about Bitcoin back in 2013. I wasn't really interested in how many people were watching or like whether we could get it to go viral. All of the SEO titles that I've done for this show, I did in complete and utter irony. And I want the authenticity. I want the connections. What I value the most is you right now watching this, not because the channel's popular, but because you happened upon this YouTube stream right now. Maybe you were following me on Twitter, or maybe you heard about it from a friend and you just decided you liked it. So that's my opening gambit. And I'm joined by two very special panelists today. Shinobi, are you there, or is your VPN giving you trouble?
I'm here. I think there's two of me here.
Yeah,
did I clone myself?
You just forked yourself, and now there's two chains, and we have to wait for 100 blocks.
Oh no! So we won't know whether to trust what I say.
No, I don't know if you're the one that's going to be orphaned. We might just have to orphan everything you say on the show. Let's see how. Theo, can you come up with any more gags? You're normally good with stand-up.
Oh yeah, especially when I'm put on the spot, you know, give a joke immediately right now.
Improv.
But yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was a pretty good little shenanigan there with, you know, double, and you know, it's kind of like getting free money 2 for 1. And yeah, I agree with Chris. There's no we're not, you know, looking at the metrics for 10 hours and trying to figure out, you know, the best possible way to get more views. If we did that, then we would do a totally different show. So it's not about the views itself or how popular it is or anything like that. I mean, if our stuff has value, it has value, and that's why you're here. And the connections and all that is, of course, the main part of it.
All the friends that I made, you know, early on, and you guys still follow me, and we still like DM with each other, and sometimes we meet up. Recently I met up with a friend, a Bitcoin friend who lived on the other side of the world, and for the first time in 4 years since we first got to know each other, we had a coffee, we met up, and you know, that was really good fun. So shall we go to our first story, which is really the namesake of today's show, and it's not even news anymore, but China bans ICOs. How many times are they going to ban ICOs? Are they going to ban it as many times as they did Bitcoin back in November 2014?
They're going to ban it hard, and then they're going to unban it, and they're going to ban it hard again, and then they're going to rinse and repeat, and it's going to be the ban hammer gaveling down like a judge.
Is that they're just going to short the shit out of it every time they announce it, or what? Are they just going to buy each bottom?
Well, you can't. It's kind of difficult to short right now. I mean, you'd have to, you know, that's kind of similar to shorting penny stocks or something. You've got to be able to borrow a bunch of them from somebody. But hey, who knows? There's a lot of liquidity flowing around, or a lot in the sense of crypto at least. So who knows? But I don't think there's going to be, you know, something like 20x shorting ICOs, or 5x even. But who knows? Maybe if one of them gets more liquidity, and it can happen. Hey, Ethereum was an ICO. So just keep that in mind. You have leveraged that, so that can happen. I think China's going to ban it a lot more, because what's going to happen, like you had at early 2014, or even end of 2013 too, I don't have to look back, is these messages, these press releases, or you have the message and it's in Chinese and everyone translates it, and it's just like that game where you whisper in the other person's ear and it gets sent down. But imagine the whispering ears are, you know, spin doctors at crypto rags and Bloomberg that don't even know what in the world they're writing about when they write about crypto, and especially if they're writing about China banning stuff. A lot of things, a lot of details are wrong. Maybe the general thing is correct, that they're ICOs or temporarily ban them or put a moratorium on them. See how I just did that? Those are all could just be translated as ban, but they're not all exactly banning. So I think we're going to get a lot more of these, and are just really totally fake too. So be on the lookout for fake China bans.
I mean, I totally agree with you. Like historically, Theo, that has definitely been like the mold pattern that things follow. Like you have the bastardized translation and then the spin, and then people play the market off of that. But I really do think that it could be different this time, because it's not just China. Like we're seeing also Israel is establishing a committee to investigate ICOs and see whether or not any qualify as securities. And as you know, Bancor was actually ran out of there. Korea is starting to look into things, and this is like pretty much hot on the heels of the SEC laying down a little more clear guidance on how they're going to react in Canada. And I just really think, especially culturally from the Chinese point of view, like with a population as big as they are, it is almost impossible to manage the bureaucracies when you start getting up beyond the local level. And like multi-level marketing scams are a plague in China. And I think that like pretty much taking that kind of style of scam and like rebranding it under the ICO, I think China is going to be a lot more heavy-handed than they have with things in the past, because this isn't so much like a new problem that they're looking to deal with. It's more of a problem they've been struggling with for a long time, kind of wrapped in a new packaging.
I thought there was one part of this Bloomberg article that was really interesting at the end, where they talk about chain analysis and how much money has been amassed in such a short period of time that it's attracted cyber criminals, with an estimated 10% of money intended for ICOs looted away by scams such as phishing this year, according to Chain Analysis, a New York-based firm that analyzes transactions and provides anti-money laundering software. This is the anti-money laundering software right here.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder what percentage, I guess we won't know because it is China, but just to put it in perspective, you know, let's say that what percent, if you put ICOs in the same company as multi-level marketing or things like OneCoin, as let's just say that we're the part of the Chinese government, and we put that all in one pot, what percent of that would be ICOs? Now, of course, what you guys have talked about is just the speed that it's been going up is what's getting a lot of attention. But I'm not so sure in the grand scheme of things if it's compared to some of the other things, but maybe I'm wrong.
Cool.
I mean, it really comes down to the situation. I mean, you know, there's like I might be wrong myself, but there's going to be that one time where one of us is. You know what I mean?
I'm just inviting Preston on because he's in the chat room, and Preston.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sure he has an opinion about tokens.
Yeah, just sent you the private link, Preston. So come on in. How's Bancor doing right now? By the way, I haven't even checked on Bancor yet. Let me have a quick
I have
check.
no idea. I've heard all kinds of things about Bancor. They raised so much money so quickly.
They were one of the last ones to raise that much money in that intense period of time. They were one of the biggest. $2.49 right now on Bittrex.
Howdy, howdy.
Hey,
how's it going?
A long time.
We got a lawyer in the house, dropping some marmots.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, the marmot lawyer is definitely in the house. I'm literally in my house in America where we have marmots. So like it's all like, I don't know, what is it? It's like regression. It's like a yo dog meme, but with lawyers. And
are marmots friends with frogs?
I mean, they can be. I mean, they're little animals that hang out in the woods. But yeah, cool, I'm like, so yeah, I'm just like elated. Because I've been sitting here for 3 years saying this ICO stuff is going to end in tears, and finally, the marmot zombie apocalypse is starting to happen. So yeah, that's pretty nice. Suffice it to say.
Cool. And what's your legal take on it all? Like, talk to me about the Howey test. I want to know.
Yeah, I mean, so generally speaking, and I don't want to go into the Howey test specifically because I don't think it's particularly useful as an analytical framework. Firstly, because it only really applies in the US and Canada. And I'm not a US lawyer, just full disclosure, I'm an English lawyer. And secondly, it's because it kind of overcomplicates the issue. If you talk to a lawyer in most jurisdictions and you say, all right, well, I've got this thing and I'm selling it to someone and it kind of behaves like an investment and they're buying it with the expectation that they're going to be able to resell it at a profit later on. Unless I'm selling them like curios from the Second World War, if that thing is an instrument or some kind of digital widget which kind of acts like money and kind of we call money cryptocurrency, I think it's a pretty safe bet that a regulator is going to look at it as a cryptocurrency. Excuse me, a cryptocurrency. So there are different categories that you can slot that into. So it's a contract because someone's selling something to somebody else. Sorry, I'm on the 2 seconds, guys.
No worries.
Closing that. So it's a contract. 2 seconds, excuse me.
It's totally fine, man.
So sorry. So it's a contract. We know that, and it's a contract, and there are various regulations which can apply to that contract. If it's a securities law of some description, then what you're looking at is securities laws, whatever. You could also have it be under various unfair trade practice regimes that in the US you would see at state level, or in the United Kingdom you would see there's an Unfair Trade Practices Act, which says that when you're selling things and they start acting like investments, they start getting regulated like investments too. So it depends on, or they start getting regulated full stop. If you say anything wrong, so how many of us remember Hashlitz and Josh Garza, that guy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he's actually from Connecticut, which is where I live. And he was recently sentenced in federal court. He pled out. So what happened was he went, so he obviously did this scheme where he had these things called hashlets. And hashlets were mining contracts, and it was basically a Ponzi scheme. So he was selling the hashlets, and then he was using the proceeds from the sale of the hashlets to pay out what he said were mining proceeds to people who had bought the hashlets previously. So he was robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. In addition to that, we'll recall he had a scheme called Paycoin. And Paycoin was a scheme where he said, okay, well, I've got this cryptocurrency, and it's got a $20 floor. And what we're going to do is I'll guarantee I have $100 million in a bank account somewhere to guarantee that I will make a market for this and ensure that the floor is met. And so the market was like, oh, that's great. And they quickly began testing that. And it quickly turned out not to be true. So he went, he had to stand tall before the man. And there were 2 separate actions brought. So one of them, someone said, just like Bancor. I mean, we couldn't possibly say that. But anyway, so who knows what Bancor is? I actually haven't really looked at it because I try to avoid ICOs whenever I can. But so there were 2 actions brought. There was a civil action brought by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then there was a criminal action brought by the district attorney or the U.S. attorney here in the state of Connecticut. And he wound up pleading out, and I think it goes to sentencing phase at some point soon. But what he pled to is there wasn't any securities law charge. They could have charged him potentially if they went and did that analysis with a violation of the Howey test. But what happened instead is they just said, okay, well, this is wire fraud. You used the instrumentations of interstate commerce and the mails and the wires in order to obtain money under false pretenses from somebody else. And so there you have a very basic ordinary provision of criminal law, which if you say one thing wrong and misrepresent it ever so much or omit to say something which you should have said, then you've got a criminal situation. So there's all kinds of pitfalls, which if you're doing like a share offering, for example, as long as you tick certain things, there's safe harbors which are available to you. You can correct statements that you've made. You can make disclosures on an ongoing basis. If you do a cryptocurrency, there's no framework for that. So it's much easier to fall into into a hole and get yourself into trouble.
Do you think the US is likely to follow China after this?
It depends. I mean, it depends. To a certain extent, we've seen the US has been interesting because they haven't really adopted a uniform approach or given any one regulator. So the US is a federal system, right? 50 different states, and then multiple federal agencies with different subject matter jurisdictions. So it could be the CFTC, because Bitcoin's kind of commodity-ish, or it could be the SEC, or it could be the Federal Trade Commission at federal level. And then at state level, it could be any one of, every state then replicates that structure. So you have state securities, enforcement agencies as well. So to a certain extent, I think there's been a bit of confusion as to who should bring what case when. And, these guys all talk to each other. It's not like you run a federal agency and you don't talk to anybody else who runs similar federal agencies and financial services. So to that extent, there's no uniform approach. We haven't seen something like the PBOC, which is, I'm not too familiar with Chinese banking regulation, but my understanding is that they have a lot more power than, for example, the SEC to determine the scope of financial regulation. Similarly, if you were in the UK and we saw the FCA or the PRA say something about ICOs, that would be pretty definitive and determinative for that entire jurisdiction. So in the US, there are multiple different ones. What we have seen are some very interesting, we have seen some interesting cases, which I think sort of start to sketch out the boundaries of what we can and can't do in the US. So you can't sell large amounts of Bitcoin on local Bitcoins or anything else, or you will be operating a money transmission business or money services business. So that's one thing you can't really do, without a license. So one. Two, running a cryptocurrency exchange is, unless you've done very extensive KYC, it looks like from the BTCE indictment that is probably a bad idea in the US, unless you're really doing a ton of due diligence. And the question of whether, has Polo or Kraken, for example, have they done that? I don't know. I don't really I barely use Polo. Once for some Dogecoin, but that's about it. So it's but I don't know what their diligence framework is or how their users transact. As we saw with the Charlie Shrem case, it's if you're willfully blind to something which your platform is enabling, depending on the degree to which you choose to ignore it, you can be criminally liable that way. And then from a securities law standpoint, there are two sets of backs that we've seen. So in August, there were 4 different trading suspensions of penny stocks that made announcements that had ICO language in them, which basically when that happens, the SEC goes, hold on a second, we're going to suspend trading in your instruments here because we're not sure about the accuracy of what you've just said. So there was one which said that they were going to use a coin as like some kind of derivative instrument to gain exposure to African listed equities, which didn't, as a securities lawyer, I kind of look at that and I'm like, that's a little funky. I've never seen that before. So that seems strange. And then recently we had a thing called Protostar, which was a kind of like a content creation incentive coin. So I think the idea was you bought the coin went to content creators such as, Mr. Chris Ellis here would go and create videos and he would monetize those videos. And then what would happen is you would get a share of the profits. In England, I'm not going to say, in the US, in England, that kind of looks like a profit sharing contract, right? A little bit. So there you're starting to move into security territory. And then you're starting to, that's a regulated business. So for all kinds of reasons, you don't want to do that. So the SEC called them up, apparently, we are told by the company, and said, hey, we heard you guys did this thing. Why don't we have a chat about it? And the CEO was like, yeah, I think I need to talk to some lawyers. And then they agreed to just unwind the fundraise and pay all their users back. And they said that was the best move. So where we are now is we've had that series of transactions or in series of communications between the regulator and those various entities that have done those various things. And the question is, will there be any definitive, they come down and set the precedent? Good question. We don't know. So that's kind of where we are now. It's, a lot of the ICO bears and the lawyers in the community who've been widely mocked for years for warning about this and saying you guys really shouldn't be such cowboys are now sitting back and going, okay, well, maybe next time you'll listen to us. So that's where we are.
What is the difference legally between an ICO and traditional shitcoins that came before, all the different forks, like Dogecoin you mentioned?
Yeah, I think so. Dogecoin was an interesting one. I think so you've got your shitcoin, let's say. So you have a coin of some kind. But let's wind up even further back. Let's look at counterparty, right? So if we look at the Howey test, which is the way that the Americans and the Canadians determine whether something is a security. They ask 4 questions. They say, is there an investment of money with the expectation of profit as a consequence of that in a common enterprise with the where those profits would arise from the efforts of a promoter or a third party. So those 4 pieces. And if you don't have one of them, that's not necessarily determinative, but it's a good way to say, well, I haven't satisfied one of these legs, therefore this thing isn't a security. So if, for example, you say there's no investment of money, but there's an expectation of profit in a common enterprise and yada, yada, yada. Well, it's what? That's a gift. That's saying, well, I'm going to do this thing, and there's no investment of money and there's no contract, and if I'm done, maybe I'll give you a portion of it. So that's one way that you could look at it. There are other things that you could do, like not actually have investments of money. So you could start a coin of your own, fine, push go, and then you could have everybody mine it, and then you could say, well, no one paid me anything to do this. I did all the development work up front. Actually, and to be honest with you, with most cryptocurrencies, that's how it's developed anyway. Most of the dev is sort of front-loaded into the Genesis block. So Zcash it had front-loaded most of its development into the Genesis block. Monero did the same thing. Who else? Filecoin and One Bennett. They're going to do that too. So there you have at least a product before the coin is created. And that's a good question, whether that changes the analysis. Contrast to something like EOS, where they've said, we're going to do a coin, and the coin will fund the development of the second coin, which will be the actual product. Or Tezos, for example, which did an ICO. So if you don't have an ICO, if there's no offering of coins, if there's just a coin that's there and people can go mine it, that somewhat changes the equation. Counterparty is another interesting one, because that was just spend Bitcoins to an address, and we will ensure that Bitcoins are destroyed, and no one can ever access them again. So what you've done is you've created something which is artificially scarce, which had a cost. So you're saying, look, if you want to be involved in this community, we want to see you commit resources to it, but that commitment of resources is something you never get back. So, and it's not something which enriches the original dev team. So there you have another way of doing this still. I think what it boils down to is, is your dev team, have they got most of the work done and now they want to just say, okay, this is a coin which does coiny type things like Satoshi did, or are they trying to get development funds? Legally, there may be, it may not matter what the difference is. I think it would, it's a different set of facts to consider. And I think, depending on the jurisdiction, you still might run into minefields or pitfalls, but at least if you're doing a coin, you're not selling anything to anybody. They're just doing it on their own. They're mining it on their own. They're engaging it on their own. And there's not, if I created the software, I pushed go, and I didn't do anything else after that point. Yeah. Then, but there's still an announcement cycle that the dev team goes through, and there are pump and dumps. And sometimes the dev team don't have any control over the pump and dumps that happen on those exchanges. And I can attest firsthand, and working with people in the industry early on, that I saw that happen. And the dev team and the miners, they had no control over what was going on Polo and BTCE. Yep, and that's extremely bad behavior. Not by the devs and not by the exchanges, and but by the whales. Who have bought these things at low prices, then gone and made announcements, and then said, well, okay, well now it's gone to the moon, and we pump, and then it collapses again. So that's terrible behavior. It's not something I think that a dev could be, as long as they had nothing to do with it. I can't see them having any liability for it. And yeah, pump and dumps happen. They happen on the penny stock market. They happen now. I think the exchanges are accountable to the CFTC, right? If the pump and dumps happen, we've seen Polo, for example, stop listing Einsteinium or whatever, or it ceased trading, halted trading on it, because it found out there was a pump and dump going on a Telegram group. Yeah, I wouldn't want to comment on what I think their liability is. Obvious, but it's slightly different for the exchanges, clearly. than it would be for someone who just created the coin and said, I've created, Marmot coin is the typical example I use of the hypothetical coin that I've never created. And so like if I created Marmot coin tomorrow and said, I've got this thing, and then I just let it go and then had nothing to do with it ever again, query what the liability would be there. And I don't think it would be much.
What's Paratilton going to do now?
That's yeah.
How about a little more serious question?
Go on.
It seems like now that we're finally here in like the big wave, like we have all the countries in East Asia, North America, Europe starting to lay down guidelines or at least a rough framework to start moving towards regulation. Given that the cryptocurrencies and things using these types of platform are such a global, like frictionless platform, what do you think the odds are that we might start seeing a lot more major coordination between jurisdictions on an international level to kind of establish a more consistent framework to enforce going forward?
So we're seeing that already with, so there are two things that I think we should look to for that. The first one was when Alpha Bay and that Dutch darknet market got taken down. And there you had extensive cooperation and collaboration between the Department of Justice and Europol. So Europol is a coordinating agency for the various European law enforcement agencies, Germany, Britain, all those. So Britain for now until they leave. So that's the first bit. There was extensive cooperation there. The second one, of course, was the BTCE takedown, which involved an arrest and an extradition from Greece. So there, I think, I noticed one thing when I was a very, very junior lawyer. I did a couple of European cartel cases. And one thing which the enforcement agencies do is they you can see them spider walking from one area to the next, to the next, to the next, as they discover progressively, worse types of wrongdoing. So there are a whole bunch of cases, for example, where they were looking at, well, actually, I don't want to get into it, but you can see how one set of cartel cases leads to discovering naughty behavior in another industry or by another entity. So query whether the investigation into Mt. Gox obviously led to the discussions on BTCE, and then, now they've taken down BTCE, where are they going to go next? Now that they've learned, they've presumably seized some hard drives and presumably there's some information and alleged, who knows who's cooperating or who's talking. So you can see them moving step, 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 step. And so we just don't know where they'll go next. But I have very little doubt that they're in very regular communication with each other. I'm actually going to step outside. So I'm here in a house full of people, so I may have to move around. But yeah, they're definitely in regular communication with each other. What they do next is a question of what their immediate law enforcement priorities are, and we just don't know that. Mm-hmm.
And we have a question from the chat. How long until Vitalik and co are arrested, says Wall Street?
Inappropriate question.
Inappropriate.
Inappropriate.
It's not appropriate. Come on.
Not appropriate. I mean, no, it's not an appropriate question. It wouldn't be appropriate to answer it. I mean, I think the thing that we should really be talking about here is, I was always involved in the lame part of crypto, which is using blockchains, in a really regulated way. I think there are arguments to be had where we can use this technology to do, 2 seconds, do some interesting stuff. I'm going to get up for 2 seconds, so give me a minute. But we can use the technology in legal ways without creating cryptocurrency, without shilling, without selling this stuff, without lying about what the technology can and can't do. Why don't we sit back and go, okay, we have a distributed system now. It does this, and we're not going to make a coin out of it, but we're going to do something else so we can communicate without using Google, for example, in order to manage this document. We're not going to use Google, Spy Docs. What we're going to do now is we're going to use our own version of Google Docs to amend this. We're not going to use Amazon Web Services, maybe. I'm not sure blockchains are really in a position to replace that. But we're going to build another application where we're going to use the blockchain to communicate and keep things in sync. This slow piece of junk database, we're going to use that instead of going and relying on someone else. And that's what they are. Blockchains are slow. They're difficult to work with. They're not fast. They're not easy. The UX is terrible. And that is inherent to what a blockchain is. It's not supposed to be easy to use. However, what a blockchain is very good at is staying up and just continuing to run, despite the fact that everyone has a huge amount of incentive to take it out and knock it down. Bitcoin and Ethereum have shown that you have these, effectively, well, the whole market. It's a $175 billion bug bounty, and no one has claimed it. So I think we can look at it that way and say, let's turn this into some IT. On the one hand, I think guys like you, Chris, would be more into the revolutionary IT, whereas guys like me are more about let's go and make this some transaction management IT. But there's something that this stuff can be useful for, and people have all kinds of ideas. It's just a question of sitting down, getting the funding, and now building out for those.
Yeah, great. So Shinobi, do we want to move on from this segment? We've ended up having a really nice discussion here, Preston. Thanks so much for coming on and jumping on in the chat.
No problem. I'll watch the rest of it from YouTube.
Sure. All right. Well, feel free to stick around if you want to.
Oh, okay, I'll stick around then. Fine. Easy.
Watch it from inside the backstage.
We were going to talk a little bit about a roadmap that was found on the side of the road.
A roadmap, a BCash or Bitcoin. How am I supposed to pronounce it without getting into trouble? Bitcoin Cash.
The
Bitcoin Cash roadmap.
But this is actually, I think, just a nice tool to kind of look at a lot of the claims made by this group that has, I guess, culminated in BCash being born, and just kind of look at the consistency of some of it. I mean, if the first section of this is really just kind of a breakdown of the core roadmap, obviously SegWit, and next up is the Schnorr signatures, and then hopefully introducing Johnson Lau's masked idea to get a little more complex with the scripting capabilities. But then it kind of moves on into discussing what BCash could do. And I would like to point out also that the person who wrote this is not actually a BCash developer. All they did was develop the wallet, I believe. Don't quote me, I might be wrong here, but I think this is the person who forked Electrum and then developed Electron. But one of the first things he does is go into talking about the new difficulty adjustment algorithm. And the way that this is framed is kind of implying that the way it works in Bitcoin is flawed. And part of the reason that he asserts this is obviously with multiple SHA-256 coins out there, if any of them are profitable at a scale, that creates a more dynamic flow between the two. And he essentially tries to lay out the notion that their difficulty adjustment is an improvement over Bitcoin's, which I think is very interesting considering how things have played out with it. We've seen it kind of cycle in and out. You've had rapid adjustments where you've gone from a no block for 8 hours at a time to blocks being spat out every minute. It's very inconsistent. And this has a lot of implications for both the throughput of the system as well as the economic stability of the incentives. For instance, I think everybody remembers the 8 megabyte block that they did to prove it could be done. Well, all that was a single block, a single blip on the network in terms of resource uses, and then it went pretty much right back to almost empty blocks. So it didn't actually show how well the network could handle that kind of load on a constant basis. And now if we're in a situation where the difficulty starts moving downwards and you have a lot of miners pile in and blocks start getting churned out every minute, imagine an 8 megabyte block every minute. Not only are they going to have to download it, they're going to have to verify it, then they're going to have to relay it, and that propagates with an exponential delay, essentially, each step out from the node it starts from. They've never really tested how their network could handle a full block of 8 megabytes under that kind of load. And I think that they've likely been intentionally avoiding that because it would be a disaster just in terms of a 1 megabyte block could take 30 seconds with the worst case number of signatures per transaction to validate. So imagine you blow that up 8 times, you have a block that's 4 minutes to validate, and they're coming in every minute. I mean, that gets pretty bad pretty quickly. And it's kind of silly to say that that's an improvement from Bitcoin. And moving on to the next section, fixing transaction malleability the right way. This section.
I thought the malleability was a feature.
That was actually the first thing I was going to mention. This article tries to pretty much say that SegWit is fixing a problem, but in the wrong way. Well, I remember, I think Chris is throwing it up on screen right now, quite a lot of people screaming that malleability is a feature and not a bug, and that it was put there by Satoshi specifically to prevent second layers from being built out, as if it's pretty much just rationalization from my point of view. Like they have axiomatically decided that something is the case, and so are just rationalizing. And it's really funny to kind of see them try to walk this back now with how many people were asserting that so fervently. And even past that, they go on to claim that SegWit. Okay, let me walk back and clear up my words a little bit. Essentially, the reasoning behind SegWit and the way it was structured and rolled out as a soft fork was to avoid a chain split in solving malleability. It's opt-in, obviously, on every level from the user all the way up to what the miners include in their block. And anybody who wants to utilize a feature that needs a malleability fix can, and anybody who doesn't have to use it. Well, they go on and attempt to paint this picture, well, the split happened anyway. And I find it very interesting that they're attempting to rationalize, well, SegWit caused a split anyway, when they're essentially a camp of people that have just been contradicting absolutely anything, no matter how rational and backed up by evidence that anybody supporting core asserts. And then they just go around and make happen what wasn't supposed to happen. Like, we come to the table with a solution that it's opt-in, it doesn't force anybody into thing, it can avoid the split. And then they go, well, we're going to split anyway. See, that didn't work. And it's a ridiculous line of reasoning. Like it's somebody intentionally being a contrarian and then trying to use that pointless contrarianism as a justification for why your assertion is incorrect.
Chris, that's the point that Chris makes in his blog post, the first one that we put up. And I actually felt like it wasn't a bad point, because if you think about it sociologically, or the social psychology and the dynamics in the community and the way that interfaces with the technology, it's not an entirely untrue statement that effectively we ended up with a split anyway, whether or not it was the fault of those that wanted to go off and be contrarian and create a user activated hard fork, as they called it, which really just came across to me as quite churlish and spiteful. They were just doing it as a one-upmanship over the UASF, because UASF kind of forced everyone's hand and everyone had to act by the 1st of August. We probably wouldn't have SegWit without it. But then the other side in this debate, and I want to point out here that I'm not talking about a literal demarcation and saying this is another group of people, because we're all individuals here and we all have overlapping viewpoints. They went off and they created a user activated hard fork just so that they could be opposed to it. But he's not entirely wrong that it ended up creating a chain split in any case, in order to get this, what he describes as a cumbersome and ugly hack, which of course he's referring to SegWit.
Well, yeah, but that's kind of my point. Like it's his and anybody else's right to fork away onto their own system. I mean, that is the beauty, the strength, like the central tenet of these systems. They are completely voluntary. But I just find it very ridiculous to just place the blame on SegWit, where the blame is the individuals who choose to fork away and break away. And from me looking inside out, or outside in, I mean, it very much seems like that's just an excuse. Like that they have wanted to break away for a long time for a whole slew of reasons that, in my opinion, seem much more just like wanting to be in control. And they simply are trying to use SegWit as the scapegoat to get there, to try and paint Core as some kind of agitator or reckless group.
Well, also UASF, I think, is what that whole movement and the ability and the competence, I think, of a lot of people, you included, perhaps I'm included in that group of people, who are very good at promoting things online. We've got Twitter accounts that, you know, we've got lots of followers. We're influencers, to use the lingo, though I hate that term. And there was a very effective campaign, social media campaign, with people virtue signaling in their profiles, which I've been mocking a lot, and putting UASF in their usernames in order to try and spread awareness. And that was politics. You know, politics in the sense of, you know, what the question of what do we do now given the balance of power, and the power that was exhibited was this social influence power, this ability to say, look, I've got, you know, 4,000 followers, I've got 10,000 followers, and if I put this little hashtag in my username, think about all the users that are not going to run, you know, your software. They're going to run this software, and this software is going to be diametrically opposed to what you've been working hard on campaigning for the last 2 or 3 years. I felt like the precedent was set when Gavin Andreessen and Mike Hearn decided to start using back channels as a mainstay of how to get their goals met. Rather than going on the mailing list and communicating in the ways that have been done before, they decided instead to start talking to businesses on the back channels and actually lobbying for support of a particular piece of software that was going to break the consensus rules and create some kind of fork.
Well, see, but that again is kind of like, it comes back to the heart of the matter. Like I was actually like personally loosely involved in the origin of the UASF as a concept, in running through the fringe cases, the possibilities, the downsides, the risks, and actually kind of bringing it into being. And that has nothing to do with any Core developer. That idea did not start with Core from anybody that has contributed anything to that piece of software. And it's trying to conflate the blame and responsibility for things. Like, to say that the UASF caused this, okay, that very much will be the case, but then you can't lay the blame at the feet of Core, because they didn't have anything to do with it.
I want to suggest, instead of words like blame, maybe we say contribution, because as you acknowledged, everyone is individuals. One of the things that annoyed me so much about this debate was the way everyone was put into nice tidy piles, and like, you're a big blocker and you're a small blocker, and no one ever really created a matrix of all the people of like, you know, well, actually, yes, I would like to see a block size increase, I just don't think it should happen right now, and I'm okay with the 1 megabyte block, or I think we should implement SegWit first. I never saw that matrices. I never saw anyone kind of come up with anything like that.
Can I just chime in here for a second?
Please do.
Yeah. So as like a non-Bitcoiner, really, because I'm very conservative in just about everything, I see these discussions within Bitcoin about people arguing over, you know, how many angels can fit on the head of the pin. And it reminds me of doctrinal arguments in the Catholic Church from like 1300. And so you're sitting there like, guys, you're talking about the same thing, like the same issues. Your interests, your economic interests are more or less aligned. And so it's just hilarious to see how people who agree on so much can disagree so violently on so much.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that really comes down to kind of like Chris is really kind of helping me steer my words in the right direction here. I'm generally kind of a hothead, and I can overgeneralize a lot. But that really comes down to like the meat of what I'm trying to drive at is, yes, we all have a similar goal. We all want our Bitcoin to become valuable. Yes, we all have a similar goal in the sense that we want everybody to be able to use Bitcoin cost effectively. But where the disagreements and the divides come in is the specific engineering details and how do we accomplish that. And to kind of skip to the end of this BCash roadmap here, if you go down to the last section on sharding, I think that this illustrates this perfectly. The first sentence in this is, the holy grail of blockchain scalability is not pushing all transactions off onto centralized or quasi-centralized layer 2. I think the centralized, quasi-centralized part is a bit of a straw man. Platforms, but rather removing the need for all nodes to download and validate all transactions for the system to work. Now, if you really break that down, the entire scaling plan pushed forward by core developers right now in building out secondary layers is with the explicit goal of exactly that, partitioning the actual transactional use so that people only validate that base layer and then what is built on top that is relevant to them. And what they're trying to say here in terms of sharding is, let's not structure this out so that there is a base layer that everything ties back to, is cryptographically pegged to, that we can verify to have a guaranteed starting point, and then work our way off of that to validate what we're involved with. They're saying, let's just take the whole base layer and fragment it and split it up into little pieces so that the base layer of the entire currency supply is scattered around and turned into little partitions for the exact same goal, so that you only have to validate what you're involved in. And that's just incredibly short-sighted, and I think personally emotionally driven arguments to get to the same place in a really inefficient way, just because they want to do things differently than another group at this point due to mostly personal reasons.
Yeah. Theo, do you have something you wanted to come in with?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that you don't shard on me. But really, what I wanted to say is that without sharding on anybody, is that when you meet the people in person, what you guys are saying about I like this, the angel, what was it? How many angels fit on the tip of a pin, or whatever, like religious guys in the same religion philosophizing, arguing about, these minute things. Sure, for an outsider, it definitely is like that. But that's the thing. I think that's why people need to get out of their basements and meet conferences are not always the best, or meetups or whatever. But I think when you meet the people face to face, it's a totally different, or it's a lot different dynamic than online. And, everyone trolls each other and, uses pictures of marmots and frogs and whatever, you know what I mean? And that's all good and fun, and there's a point to it. But I think that then you realize how close people are when you're able to communicate in person. That's what I mean. You think, yeah, but you're on the other camp or whatever, and you're like, I'm so shocked that I can talk to you, or something like that. You know what I mean? It's totally, in my experience, it's a lot different than online. So I think I would encourage people to do that, especially if you think.
I had that with Krista Rose. Krista Rose and I hated each other online for like months and months and months. And then we bumped into each other at the American Banker Conference in New York, and kind of like sized each other up, like sort of like two cats, like kind of like unfamiliar with each other. And then we're like, oh, whatever. And like, we actually now get along reasonably well. I totally agree with what you just said. Everything.
Yeah. And I mean, even as like just a middle ground, there's platforms out there for voice talk all over the internet. We're using one right now.
Yes,
like this entire show was birthed out of the Bitcoin Mumble, like or Dragon's Den. We kind of float between both names. There's places like Whale Pool, like all of these voice chats out here. Like just taking that jump to the different medium in a digital way is such a huge step up in the ability to actually clearly communicate. And like I believe Chris said this last week, just to get over that rage when you're sitting there reading something that contradicts what you're trying to assert, and just getting angry and skipping over it and not reading through the whole thing and then replying to a misconception. Like once you actually get in a vocal medium where everything is real time, you can clear things up in real time. It's just so much more productive for communications.
Well, it's also the nonverbal language, the power language, the body language. And I think also because the internet gives us this distance, people feel unafraid to be rude and lash out. Whereas when you meet someone face to face, that completely changes the dynamic. You can't just lash out. You want to keep yourself below the threshold of violence, as much as possible. You don't want to create a scene. Why? Because you can't run away. With the internet, you always know you can close that lid on the laptop anytime and you can just walk away from the situation, although very few people do, and they probably should. And they probably should have done for many of the flame wars we've experienced over the last 2 years. But they have the option online. They don't have that option face to face. So I think a lot more people should be engaging in richer communication mediums when discussing the more important elements. And I'm not saying we shouldn't use Twitter anymore at all. I'm just saying, like, Twitter's very good at low latency, high transaction throughput. It's great for news and headlines. It's just not that good for conversation and dialogue. Really what you want to do is break out into a richer medium once the conversation starts to degrade on Twitter. So this is quite a long show. Should we skip ahead? I think I did have one other thing I just wanted to highlight to make sure we drove the point home on that last article before we move on, which is that Chris is saying that people can still, should still be able to validate the node, as you were laying out, that basically this is two different ways of achieving the same point. But I will point out to people is that I just set up a Bitcoin Cash full node. I had to for my job, and I was going through it. I've got plenty of options already in the client to be able to prune the node, to be able to only look at the TXs as they enter and come out of the mempool. I've got options to limit the bandwidth to a certain number of megabytes per day. I've got lots of customizations that I can make in the config file. So actually a lot of this stuff, even without SegWit, was already happening. Like Bitcoin Core were already working on it. And I personally didn't have a problem with their roadmap and their timeline, which is why I chose to kind of stick with them, although I didn't do a whole lot of virtue signaling. So let's skip, we'll come to the OpenBazzar at the end. So we'll go out of order as it's written in the description at the time of airing. I just thought it was more relevant to talk about Bitcoin Core 0.15 being released, and we've got a massive improvement in fees, allegedly. Is that right, Shinobi?
Yeah, they've actually, I'm still kind of going through a lot of the notes, but they've done quite a lot with this release, actually. They're moving towards better fee estimation and ways to kind of mitigate attack vectors that existed there, which would allow people to pretty much spam and trick your client into paying higher fees than it would, and little safeguards like that to make sure you're pretty much not overpaying when you shouldn't be. And they've also introduced a little smarter logic in dealing with change outputs, so that there's a kind of a rolling limit, so that based on the average fees at the time, you're not creating outputs that are going to be uneconomical to spend. So I know a lot of people like to point that out as a way to kind of poke at their development roadmap and pace. So here's something to kind of deal with that. But two of the more important things, though, that I think are really great news is they've made a lot of changes in the way that you actually handle your the buffer for handling data before it's actually read or written to the database on the hard drive, so that this actually speeds up a lot of the sync. And the most important thing I am really excited about is they've upgraded the UTXO database format. So essentially, pretty much when Bitcoin first started, there was no such thing as an unspent transaction output set. There was just the blockchain. And when you provided an input for a transaction, the client would actually have to go parse back through the entire chain and find that and make sure that nothing conflicted with it, and then it would validate it. And Peter Woolley actually was the one who introduced the UTXO set as its own database to kind of speed up the validation of blocks as they came in. But what this was structured like was essentially it would have the actual transaction that the output was created in, and it would index all of the outputs from that transaction based on that transaction ID. So you would effectively be grabbing like that whole set based on the transaction ID, modifying that, and then having to go back and modify the actual subset of outputs under that transaction ID. And they've moved things over so that everything is pretty much stored just by output. So this resulted in, I believe, a 10% reduction in memory use and an almost 40% increase in the sync speed. So this is really awesome. I mean, it's, to some of the non-technical people out here, it might not seem like that big of a deal, but this is a phenomenal increase in the efficiency of just syncing your node, the validation of a block as soon as it comes in. This is a huge optimization going forward that should make it a lot less painful for people with lower end hardware to be able to fully validate.
Yeah, so one of the bench tests, as many of you have been following me for a few years know, that I like to run full nodes on single board processors like the Raspberry Pi and also the Odroid as well. And old laptops, anything, if I can repurpose something, if someone's got like a computer in the attic and, you know, they want to repurpose it and make it useful again. And a lot of the time, the problems you run into with that kind of low-cost hardware, particularly if you're trying to recycle something, is the memory space. And if somebody wants to actually use the full node productively, like they want to actually run a service on it, an API, they just want to, like, you know, use it as their own internal node for querying the blockchain. Oftentimes, the only thing you can really use cheaply, affordably, is one of these kind of memory sticks or an old hard drive that might not be reliable. And now what you're saying, Shinobi, is that the IOs on the input outputs you get on the memory will be more efficient. So hopefully we'll get more longevity. I always kind of recommend the SanDisks, and I use this one by Corsair, 256 gigabyte. It's under about £70 in the UK on Amazon. So this one I find to be durable, reasonably priced. It hasn't died on me yet. I've been using a couple of them in the Pis, and they seem to run fine for months and months. I haven't had a single one die on me yet.
Yeah, it's much more efficient with the input output on the disk. So that's not only going to be a great thing for just the speed of syncing things, keeping up to date, but yeah, that is going to help a lot with the lifetime of the actual storage medium, because obviously, you know, you wear at that the more you read and write to it.
I sort of think of the blockchain a bit like DNA. You know, so much of the information is stored in DNA, just isn't used, called so-called junk DNA, back to probably about 98% of it or so, and it's stored in the cells of our body, every single one of them. It seems really inefficient, but it's like that for a reason. And my thinking at the moment where I am is that eventually the storage will get so cheap. Probably we'll have what's it called, advanced persistent storage. Don't quote me on that, I might be wrong. But essentially we're coming into a world now where storage, where the difference between RAM and hard drives is going to start to merge, and it's all going to be massive random access, and you're just going to be able to advanced persistent market, Preston says, and basically you're going to have like hard drives that are almost the speed of RAM, where you're just going to have so much space on there, you're just going to write in a very linear fashion to the whole disk, and you're just going to keep on writing petabytes and yottabytes and zettabytes of data until you eventually run out, and then you think, well, screw it, I'll just start again from the beginning and just go back through it. And I think that people will store the blockchain like every cell in the body stores DNA, because it'll be completely inconsequential to their storage costs. It'll just be so cheap. And you will want that information for yourself because of how important it is at scale to be able to trust that a sequence of events happened in a certain order whilst you weren't looking. Like it's such an important part. That's my theory at the moment. I could be wrong. Happy to be proved wrong on that.
Oh, I'm totally right there with you, Chris. I mean, one of the things that I think is the most misapplied argument in this space is the notion that improvements in the storage space and processing power is a reason to just start ramping up the block size like crazy. I think it's more the reason why validating is going to become practical for everybody if we don't just crank the block size up to an insane level. I mean, 2 years ago, I really used to have a lot of sleepless nights wondering like how quickly is the cost of validation going to rise? Like if we do increase the base block size, like how quickly is that going to get out of the economic realm of possibility for most people? And I'm running a full node on my phone right now. Like 2 years ago, I was worried that it might not be possible for me to run it on a desktop without dumping money specifically into that. I have it on my phone now. Where are we going to be in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now?
So it's kind of like marathon running, right? Like I've been changing up my diet recently. I've been revisiting some of those old forums I used to be on about changing up your diet. And I also used to do long distance cycling as well when I was younger. And sprinting is very different to long distance running. Long distance running or cycling, or any of you into triathlons or whatever, you know that there is an art to being able to keep your body in a pace where it can actually run in a way. You have to be able to conserve your energy. You know there's going to be a lot of lactic acid building up. And if you start the race too quickly, you're going to pay for it, like painfully later on. And so for me, I always think foundationally, and I think that the Crypto Bit Seeker is bringing up an important point here, where he's talking about the fact of how much time it will take to address the database, not just to be able to store it. But I think it's important to point out that the kind of storage mediums that we're looking at rolling out in the next 10 years are going to be almost at the speed of RAM, if not faster. We can't see the future, we don't know, but it's going to be very, very quick. And particularly when, Shinobi, you're talking about, Peter Willer's attempts to, put the UTXO set so that we have some caching capabilities. A lot of people don't know because they don't run a full node. And that's why, as an educational thing, I try to get everyone to run full nodes just so that they can feel it, to feel is to touch is to understand. Yeah. When you actually have it in your hands, a lot of people don't realize that just downloading the blockchain isn't all there is to it. Like you have to do a full TX index. That's going to take up even more space because now the database is actually going to cache and it's going to set up a whole set of memory allocated to so where you can look up all the TXs. So if you want to run an Explorer, for example, that kind of thing. And so there are ways that we can get around, I think, the latency issue of addressing the database at speed. And I think eventually the technology will come. It really is just about getting the right cadence, as they say in sports science, and really making sure that the software works in lockstep with the hardware. And for me, I want to try and keep it at that level where a hobbyist can still engage with the database, the global database, even if they have to pay a time penalty, as has been pointed out by Crypto Bit Seeker, right? That is true. You will pay a time penalty. There may be some cost penalties involved as well, and there may be some troubleshooting that one has to do in order to get it to work. But as a hobbyist and enthusiast, I'm happy to pay those costs to get, for the decentralization and all of those other merits. So
yeah, it's going to be hardware and software that make this thing scale, not just one or the other.
Yeah, and that's how you get people, right, is by making it accessible. And yeah, Crypto Bit Seeker is saying he agrees. Well, that's fantastic. Okay, so last story of the day, OpenBazzar, TLDR. This is an article by Andreas Brecken.
Brian, we still love you.
We still love you, Brian. But this article caught my eye from Andreas on Twitter, and we follow each other. And he was saying, OpenBazzar is unstable and has no listings. I was unable to use it to buy or sell online. And I actually read through this article. It's really, really good and kind of sad at the same time. But it sounds like Andreas has actually gone out of his way to set up a bunch of, go to the Git repos of these various projects in the space, download all the dependencies, actually get it running from source, no binaries, thank you very much, and actually try to get things running to see if they're just, marketing gumph, or is it a real thing? And oftentimes, people kick something up on GitHub and it kind of looks fancy because it's got all these, JavaScript and shit written on it. But then when you actually get to run the thing, it's just crickets.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel bad to kind of do this. Like, I love Brian. Like, he's one of my favorite people in this space. But like the OpenBazzar, this is kind of one of those things that I just think it was tried too early. Like, I mean, an idea like this is definitely something that is possible in the long term, something that will have merit in the long term. But it's too early. Like, it's just the technical problems of structuring a marketplace like this on a peer-to-peer level. It's hard. I mean, Amazon, look at how long they have held the monopoly and how consistently they continue expanding on it as an internet like marketplace. Even just for like the small shops that set up and sell their things through this, like there is a lot of work and back end infrastructure that goes into that. And we're just not quite there yet to do it in a decentralized way. I mean, like if you look at the article, like they tried buying a digital thing. Most of the listings were invalid. They tried buying a physical thing. At first, the person wouldn't ship it to where they were at. So then they tried shipping it to a friend of theirs where they would. It was invalid. And it's just, and on top of just all the technical side, there's just not enough people out there that have Bitcoin. And I mean, or even know about Bitcoin or are trying to get their hands on it yet. It's just not a deep enough market penetration to try to really establish something like this at scale. And I mean, like, I seriously, like, fucking props to him for trying. But this is just an example, I think, of a good idea that came way too soon. And I feel like this first try at it's going to flounder because of that.
Yeah, it was actually Amir Taki, right? He was at a hackathon in Toronto, I want to say, somewhere in Canada, up in the Northern Territories there. And it was his brainchild, but then obviously Amir kind of moved on to other things like fighting ISIS. And it was kind of taken over, and I think he got a lot of funding. And also I want to maybe get Andreas on the show with us, because he's doing some great stuff over there on his Medium. He's only got 2 posts, but I will just point out this other one he did on storage, or Storage, however you want to pronounce it, where basically it's not quite a Dropbox killer, you know. I heard Dropbox killer from Ethereum too, when they were sort of doing the rounds of the London meetup scene, and they were sort of, you know, named coin in 5 lines of code and Dropbox in 7 lines of code.
But is that really is that a thing that needs to be killed? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Sounds really, it's like the most unsexy thing you could say. I'm the Dropbox killer. Well, shit, you killed the drop. Okay, I don't need that thing.
That's what it's even like. It's so funny that there's even a sitcom called Silicon Valley that takes the piss out of all these things, and actually Storage have even done like a photo op with one of the actors from that show, and that show is basically satirizing Silicon Valley and that whole culture there. So
okay, so Storage did in summer 2014 an ICO before it was called an ICO. Not live as far as I know, or they are live with some things, but
yeah,
it doesn't seem to be working as it
right. And we should do more of these, and we should get Andreas on here, because like this is really good work what he's doing right now. Like he's actually delving into it, and I've done this before in my own time. I just didn't think to, you know, make it into an article or a video, but documenting that process. I've tried to install storage before. I've tried to use, I mean, I used IPFS with some success, I have to say. And, you know, we used IPFS over on World Crypto Network when we were doing the full node stuff, because I was trying to archive things, but I just found the lack of persistence on the so-called permanent web to be really lacking. Like stuff just wouldn't get pinned. It would get, you know, taken off the IPFS network very, very quickly. So you had a lot of link rot. And I thought it was nicknamed the permanent web. So, okay, I like it. It's content address, you know, system network. I like all of these things. But a lot of this stuff that's raising, you know, getting market cap evaluations of over $1 billion just do not have, you know, when you actually look into them deeply, don't have the technology to really back up the hype that I think is coming out. Not to say there's not lots of potential here.
That's like the understatement of the century.
Yeah. I could have been stronger. I just didn't want to get sued.
What about MadeSafe? Isn't MadeSafe running? It should be running. What was it? I mean, that thing is older than Bitcoin.
Yes,
and they've done like how many different kind of ICO-ish type of things? You know, they had several kind of things like that.
It's really, you know, it's really about perception. And if you can be in a Poloniex Trollbox, which has now died, RIP Poloniex Trollbox, and you can get in there and you can like say, oh, there's some big announcement coming out and MadeSafe are partnering with this I don't know, whatever. Like there's always a partnership, Azure partnerships, and this is going to happen and that's going to happen, and then everyone pumps the coin because they get super excited, and it's not anything to do with the fundamentals. It's all just to do with price action. And
oh no, I tell that to people all the time.
Yeah,
actually, it's the opposite as far as the ICOs. Any kind of project with any kind of or some kind of substance to it probably won't raise that much money, or it might not even go to ICO. And the ones that raise a ton, it's probably a bunch of hot air. So it just doesn't matter. It's a lot of times the complete opposite of the so-called fundamental. Yeah, because there's new people contact me. Hey, I did research on this thing. What do you think about it? What is this thing? It's just another ICO. Just don't worry about it. There's so many other ones. You don't need to do hours of research on that. Do something else.
Yeah, and I mean, MadeSafe, like everybody just said, they've been around for what, like 13, 14 years now. They've been trying to do this. And I mean, now when Bitcoin first came on the scene, okay, there I can get like, okay, a new thing. Like, how can this help? Like, let's incorporate this. What can we do? Can we make the model more efficient, more secure, more performative? But it's been almost 10 years now since then, and they still haven't released anything. So what's going on there? Like, well, where's the product coming? Like, have you actually done anything yet?
A lot of things. I don't know so much. I just remember that there was one, it was already years ago. Oh, we decided just to rewrite everything in a completely new language. Just by the way, I don't know. We just decided Rust, that was the important thing. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We have to go to Rust now. And then there's going to be another language. Oh yeah. We should just switch to that one, by the way. Let's just switch to the next one. At least they're giving updates. It doesn't mean that it's actually launching. So that's the thing that people that are new or just are interested in all this stuff, just, you don't have, whatever jurisdiction might say it's a security and that someone might get sued. But there's one thing that makes it not like a share, is that you have no say and no recourse as far as if they don't deliver. So just keep that in mind.
There really is no way with these ICOs to look after the stakeholder, right? As one of the principles of that organization, company, whatever it happens to be. And especially with ICOs, it bears repeating. It's not like an altcoin because the code is an open source, that there isn't a blockchain that is autopoietic in nature and runs on its own esteem, as Preston was pointing out, that the longevity and the persistence of these ICOs is unrelenting. Like they're irrepressible things. It doesn't matter how shit your shitcoin is. Very, very few of the shitcoins that have been launched in history are totally dead. Like sometimes they just go off somewhere to like Cryptopia or wherever, some shitcoin exchange. But if you look them up on CoinMarketCap, there's still a market. People are still mining those things. So they have extraordinary persistence. But when you invest in an ICO, you're really just throwing your money at a multi-sig address on the Ethereum blockchain or wherever to a bunch of people that have no fiduciary duty. They might just be perfectly well-meaning, but then they screw up or something goes wrong, things don't go according to plan, life is life, and then people get wrecked and they go crying.
There was an interesting concept that was in the original IPFS paper called internode debt. And so the idea was, so I've always been a fan of the idea that you use these things for utility, and so you trade like for like. So what if, in exchange for seeding files, you were allowed to seed files, that kind of a concept. So you run up an account with the rest of the network that, based on the amount of utility you provide, you can then go provide that utility in another way. So I, question why people would, again, this is getting back to the I'm disrupting Dropbox. I don't use Dropbox because I don't like Dropbox. So I don't know why anyone would want to disrupt it and say, well, actually, we're going to go and have a massively open. So we're going to take all your data, encrypt it. You're going to trust that the key generation, there's nothing wrong with it. And then we're going to go shard it up and split it out all over the world for everyone to see. I don't really get that case. I think maybe though, if, going back to what we were saying earlier, let's say you wanted to take something like Bitcoin and have a persistent store where you could go reference. So let's say you're scaling something, right? Where you can say, well, we're just going to go reference that hash, and then everything afterwards we're running it, locally. So I'm running a light node instead of a full node, but I know that everything up to there is hashed so I can rely on what happened before. There, that might make sense. And then you'd say, you know what, in exchange for my running parts of this node, I'm going to be able to also, spread out some data somewhere else. So then Bitcoin maybe becomes, the medium by which you're transacting. But then, and then that makes sense because you have one data structure, which is the money. You have another data structure, which is supported by the use of the money. They're two completely separate things, and there was no ICO involved at all. So that's one potential way of looking at it. But again, that relies on people actually having useful, usable in production technology, which a lot of these ICOs don't.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Guys, look, it's been our longest show so far, and I just really want to thank you, Preston, for coming on and making this such a more lively discussion and bringing your expertise as well. Final thoughts?
When are we going back to the moon?
Just buy the dip. Bitcoin isn't. Jihan tweeted. He said Bitcoin isn't banned. That's not an ICO. You're all cool. So look, if Jihan is bullish. Well, actually, maybe that's not such a good thing.
Yeah. There was someone tweeted out, I think it was a Fred Wilson quote. What was it? If China bans it, that means that you should invest in it. Yeah. But I just want to, everybody shards sometimes on anybody.
Very good, very good. So I want to thank everyone in the chat. You've been with us. We've had like up to 60 viewers. That's really cool. And I think you're all really good people as well for tuning in. I really love the chat box, just like the old days. Thank you for being here. All of you are the right people that are here right now, and you've stuck with us through to the end of the show. I thank you. If you like what you see here, you can hit the subscribe button. You can hit the like button, but only if you want to. See you next time. Bye-bye.